Hello and welcome back to another episode of the DD Geopolitics live stream. I am your host, Sarah, and I am once again joined today by Nina Byzantina, a writer, political analyst holding a PhD in history and specializing in Russia and all things Soviet Union and US foreign policy. Because of all of your requests and my own desires, we are going to discuss the Georgian foreign agent law, Georgia, the country, for our people in the United States. This law is formally known as the Law on the Transparency of Foreign Influence, and we'll delve into why it caused such controversy, why the West refers to it as the Russian law, and who was protesting it, and why. Nina, hi, how are you today? Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me. This has definitely been something that's in the news, and like you're saying, lots of people are confusing Georgia the state versus Georgia the country because it's a country that has a very, very long history, longer than other countries, but it's kind of a niche topic. So I think hence the confusion for those that might be slightly geographically challenged.
Well, I mean, it's easy to get confused if you're just watching the protests because so many signs are in English. So.
They're in English. Well, it's actually fascinating. I don't know if you saw that BBC coverage. It was coming from BBC Russian, but I posted it on my X/Twitter, where American citizens were participating in the
spoiler alert, spoiler alert, spoiler alert.
And I just wanted to see what literally today's media coverage was like of the law, because now it's been passed and it's been ratified, and they're actually mentioning that particular little interesting tidbit in this is CBC News, and they talked about arrests of multiple people, including U.S. nationals, in the protests in Tbilisi. So then the obvious question is, why are U.S. nationals going to a far-off country in the Caucasus that half the people in the U.S. confused with a state, and why are they participating in the protests, right? That's sort of the obvious question. But I was kind of amazed that this was actually mentioned in CBC coverage of this
Maybe
this law today.
Got confused about whether it was.
They were confused. I know they're on the way to get some Georgia peaches, and they ended up getting Georgian wine, and they just kind of got sucked into the protests with signs in English. Yeah, it's just happens to the best of us. So.
Well, so just for our listeners, they probably don't even know that Georgia was formerly part of the USSR. So after the collapse through the 90s, like most of the former bloc, Georgia went through a period of instability before kind of evening itself out as best it could. But could you provide like a little bit of overview of the current relations between Georgia and Russia, and how like the general population perceives Russia and its government, and are there any like regional or demographic differences or like schisms that you can identify that kind of divides the population?
So I actually would like to jump further back in history rather, very quickly, just to give you a highlight of these relations. So Georgia, again, really small country, in very multi-ethnic country, today's Georgia, partly thanks to the border issues within the Soviet Union, much like Ukraine and other parts of the Soviet Union, which is, a separate but related topic. And it was a country that was Christianized pretty shortly after Rome officially accepting Christianity. So they've had their own alphabet, their own literature, their own art, and this predates the Christianization of Eastern Slavs in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus by several centuries. So there's that tradition of culture and literacy that goes way, way, way back. So Georgia's really kind of, even though it's a small country, they really are very proud of their history, and not just the wine, like we were talking about before you launched this episode. And so in I would say, starting from around 1500s, Georgian kings, and at that time it's not quite Georgia in its current borders, it's one of the kingdoms, the kingdom of Kakheti. They start traveling to Russia officially on official business, requesting protection. Now Russia at that time, it's Muscovite Russia, with it's slowly expanding from Moscow, is a fellow Orthodox country. So there is that religious connection. In other ways, the two countries are distinct. Georgia has its own language, its own alphabet, et cetera, et cetera. But in the context of Orthodox Christianity, obviously one of the key trajectories for both countries' development, that was the key connection. And the reason the kings of Georgia, of Kakheti, start requesting protection is because they are repeatedly being overrun by, well, initially it was the Persians and then the Turks. So those are the two powers that dominate the region. And of course, anytime Georgia or parts of Georgia is being controlled by these two countries, they completely lose their independence. There are conversions to Islam, so there are certain parts of some of the people in the Caucasus were initially Christian, and as a result of these incursions into the Caucasus throughout centuries, I'm covering like 10 centuries right now, some of the people have eventually either forcefully or voluntarily became Muslim, and some of these kind of smaller ethnicities today are Muslim because of this history. So Georgia was seeking protection from Russia. Initially, Russia was unable to or unwilling to provide this protection, but by the time we get to the official time of the Russian Empire, the late 18th century with Catherine the Great, Georgia and Russia sign the Treaty of Georgievsk, where Georgia officially becomes a protectorate of Russia. And again, this is after centuries worth of requests for that type of protection. And within that treaty, obviously now Russia is in charge of Georgia, but Georgia maintains its one of its sort of royal dynasties. It maintains its language, its culture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now today, in the context of NGOs, let's say Western NGOs operating in Georgia, there's going to be all kinds of loud screams about oppression and Russification. But there was a certain level of control coming from the Russian Empire because Georgia was a protectorate. But if you look at the situation in the grand scheme of things, the Russian protection basically saved Georgians from physical extermination. And you can compare their situation to Armenia, especially parts of Armenia that didn't really have a connection to Russia, to 1915, to what happened to Armenians. I don't want to use the G word. I don't know if YouTube and other platforms will censor us, but basically the massacre that happened to Armenians in 1915. So you can kind of, again, very, very generally, roughly speaking, you can compare the two situations. And in my opinion, Georgians in many ways were saved on more than one occasion from physical extermination or forceful conversions to another religion. And so in that sense, I am partly Georgian. I think there should be a certain level of gratitude for that, regardless of what the current politics are like. The literal survival of the Georgian people depended on Russian protection. And then we go into the Soviet period. Obviously, the Civil War was a mess. And if you go on, our favorite web resource, the Wikipedia, that is completely unbiased, as we all know, and we look at Soviet Georgia, again, you'll see that, Georgia was sort of liberated from the Russian Empire, and then big bad Soviets came in, completely disregarding the major communists coming from Georgia, right? I mean, obviously, Stalin and Beria are the most obvious examples. There were others. So there was that political movement in Georgia, regardless of whether or not Russia had any, relation to it. And so Georgia is incorporated into the Soviet Union. And as we know, many of Georgia's leaders, Georgian people, rise to the top of the Communist Party. And, Stalin being sort of the most famous, probably, of if people are asked who are the most famous Russian leaders, they would name Stalin. And Stalin, of course, was ethnically Georgian. In fact, he was Emiratian. Georgia has
a lot of our Russian heroes are Georgian. Yeah. He's Georgian. Stalin is Georgian.
Yeah, I mean, you can go to the times of Napoleon. There are multiple military leaders who are highly ranking in the Russian army, actually linked to the royal family. So Georgians were quite prominent in the Russian Empire. They were definitely, and in the Soviet Union, they definitely were amplified, much like all the other ethnicities, in terms of promoting, for better or for worse, promoting their culture, their language, developing their language, et cetera, et cetera. So again, this kind of goes back to this question of, did the USSR go too far by amplifying nationalities and promoting nationalities to the point that it was very easy for them to separate in 1991, because essentially you kind of had these established little miniature, maybe nation states. And of course, at the same time, you had the problems of the borders, because Georgia of the 16th century and Georgia of the 18th century is not the Georgia of the 20th and the 21st century. Again, there are all these other ethnicities that are part of Georgia. One of the reasons for the 2008 very short war between Georgia and Russia was the situation with Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and these two are ethnically distinct. According to them, they were being oppressed. According to Georgia, they're an integral part of Georgia. So, again, it's one of those border issues that we can extrapolate from, the Ukrainian situation and other parts of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union dissolved, it essentially dissolved along the Soviet borders. Obviously, the Soviet administrative borders were never meant to be separate states. And so we still have these issues today. But be that as it may, in 1991, Georgia became an independent state. And as such, it became the target of all the fun NGOs that came from the West, much like they went to Russia. And by 2003, we had one of the color revolutions. So if you think about 2003, this was the Rose Revolution in Georgia. 2004, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. 2005, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan. All of them are painted very nicely as being peaceful, as using these beautiful symbols of flowers and colors. But obviously, that's sort of the surface-based promotion of these events, of essentially regime changes. And so in 2003, who came into power? Well, it's our favorite Brooklyn hipster, Mikhail Saakashvili.
Well, we're not going to get to him and his tie just yet.
We'll get to
that. But I'm wondering how, after the fall of the Soviet Union, when did this sort of really closeness between like the Georgian, maybe the elite or maybe the Georgian liberals and the West, because we have this emergence, especially in Eastern Europe, of these sort of this class of Western, some born, but all Western educated and kind of trained leaders that pop up in Europe. So when did that kind of West and Georgia relationship start?
Well, some of these people, like Saakashvili, right, they were educated in the US, like, he was educated in Columbia and multiple universities, but he had he took coursework in different universities, and he had a degree from Columbia. And so obviously, as soon as the Soviet Union dissolved, it was much easier to travel to Western countries to receive education there. And obviously, the Western officialdom was very interested in training these bureaucrats. In the Soviet days, would call them cadres, right? And so basically, it was about training people that would be accepting of Western power and domination under a different name, obviously, freedom, democracy, civil society, et cetera. But yeah, these people basically went to school in the 90s. Now, there's some exceptions to that, and we'll get into the Georgian president who wasn't even born in Georgia. I mean, she's ethnically Georgian, so she's a little bit of an exception to the rule. She is from a diaspora family. She was born in Paris, and she lived in France most of her life. She was, again, we could talk about her maybe a little bit later when we talk about the foreign agent law. But I would say she's a little bit of an exception because she's a little bit older, and she is also foreign born, even though ethnically she is Georgian. And so obviously there was this influx of all the obvious NGOs like National Endowment for Democracy, et cetera, et cetera. So all the ones that you can think of as far as the biggies go, they went everywhere.
Kind of leads into what I was just about to ask you is, I know that during the late 1990s is when NGOs really sunk their claws into Georgia, and they were kind of allowed to operate, not like carte blanche, but pretty freely. Well, I guess because Georgia, didn't really know what was coming in.
Well, I mean, they were in Russia too. They were everywhere.
Right.
This is why I mentioned this on my own channel. That's why in Russian we call it the collective Soros. So when we say Soros, we don't actually mean the one man. Now, obviously, he did have the Open Society, which was, again, one of the main NGOs operating all throughout the former Soviet Union, also Eastern Europe, sort of the Soviet bloc, not just the proper USSR proper. But we basically mean the collection of NGOs that has particular cultural goals, that has particular goals of undermining the traditional cultures in these particular locations, and of course, sort of breaking down the traditional communities and allowing for more of a foreign influence. And of course, for not all foreign influence is bad, but here this would be foreign influence that would be destructive to the local populations, especially in the long term. So yeah, I would say it might not have. I don't even think it was the late 90s. I would say as soon as the USSR collapsed, I would say there might be a little bit of a difference in particular former republics versus Russia, but definitely a lot of them just flooded into those locations.
So I'll just, for the next, just for the sake of discussion, you touched on the Rose Revolution that started in late 2003. It's like pretty much even in hindsight, or it was like a textbook color revolution.
Literally, if you go on Wikipedia, it's filed under color revolutions. Now, of course, according to these mainstream Western sources, a color revolution is a good thing. It is bloodless. It is peaceful. It just happens to have all of these Western educated people coming in. But yes, it's definitely absolutely just the fact that they would be using a beautiful flower, right, or a color, to promote it is, very, very telling.
And it's interesting because you mentioned Saakashvili's education and upbringing in the West, and I also wanted to bring up the forgive me if I pronounce it wrong, but Kamara, the group, the kind of student-led protest group that was involved in the protests, and kind of comparing them. I find it interesting how similar they were to Otpor in Serbia, which was during the bulldozer revolution, and then you mentioned obviously Ukraine's Orange Revolution, and they're all
it was literally back to back to back to back. It was like a dominoes.
Well, how did Kamara gain so much momentum? Was it just was Georgia under is it like an isolationist in the sense that people weren't getting out information?
Well, I would also say there was also this, just very, very generally speaking, in all of the former Soviet republics, there was this myth of the West. And the myth of the West came from either Hollywood or Western products that were coveted, just like the token blue jeans and Coca-Cola and chewing gum. Also broadcasts from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, like that sort of thing. There was this idealization of the West. So it wasn't even, let's say for Georgia, anti-Soviet or anti-Russian sentiment per se initially, right? It was just this idealization of financial and economic abundance, right? Like this is something that came from all of these different ways of promoting, American culture, but also Western culture as well, Western European, right? Sort of very commercial culture. I'm not talking about general, let's say Bavarian culture in Germany. I just mean very, very consumerist, being able to buy whatever you want, being able to travel. And so the Soviet Union was a closed country in the sense that it was not easy for people to travel abroad until the 80s, until Perestroika, right? And so this idea that you were finally going to be, financially abundant, we're going to be facing towards the West, it's much of that was done through American soft power even before the NGOs. There's this idea. And so it took very, close, I would say, close relationship with the West to, for some people, and we're still seeing that not for all, they sort of realized that the West is not all it's cracked up to be. And of course, lots of people immigrated, and they realized that living in the West is not as easy and beautiful and amazing and free of problems as they initially thought. So it took a little while, but I would say especially in the 90s, it was that just idealization of having contacts with the West, and now we're going to be rich, now we're going to be, now we'll be traveling all over the world, that really, just kind of pulling on the human very base instincts of, I'll be rich, I'll never be hungry, I'll have all these amazing clothes. And so that's, the idea of all these new nouveau riche, right, came from that as well. So I would say there was definitely kind of fertile soil for some of these, for the Western NGOs to operate, but also for the acceptance of people who are, like, let's say the Georgian president, right? Initially, she came in as a foreign minister. She was literally a French diplomat. Within a year, she becomes a foreign minister thanks to Saakashvili, who is also coming, right? He's also educated in multiple Western universities. So I think having these, the idea of that we have these people that were trained abroad and they're going to make our country so much better because they have this training from the outside. I think yeah, the idealization factor, I would say, was really, really important. And of course, initially, Georgia was just getting a lot of funding too. So I know that at first, Saakashvili really, I think he raised the salaries of civil servants, like the police, and everyone was like, "Wow, there this really is amazing. Look, he's really improving our country really quickly." But it wasn't because he was amazing; it was because there was all this influx of funding coming into Georgia, and he was, at least at first, he was actually using it, reasonably well. So yeah, it was definitely, let's say, a little bit of false advertising there at
Well,
play.
how did the installation of Saakashvili affect Russian, German, or Georgian relations? I know that at one point Putin was kind of like, "This isn't that such a bad thing," but then he goes quickly like, "Okay, maybe this is a bad thing." But so, how did that? Like, what was the relation between Russia and Saakashvili?
Well, first of all, Russia was on the brink of collapse itself, right? The neoliberal 1990s were an absolute nightmare for everyone except for the very few who got rich off of essentially looting the resources that used to at least officially belong to the people in the Soviet Union, right? So you had hyperinflation, you had mass privatizations of organizations, institutions, factories that belonged to the people, to the state. You had like a literal lack of food to the point where people were dumpster diving and fainting from hunger. And you had a massive brain drain. This is when my parents chose to immigrate because they were scientists. They had no work. They had no money to feed themselves or the children. And so, yeah, it was an absolute nightmare. So Putin comes into power with Yeltsin, right? Some people say that's the only good thing that Yeltsin did. 1999, right? And then 2000. And then, of course, Russia, in addition to all this economic turmoil, Russia is also in the throes of the first/the second Chechen war that goes from the mid 90s all the way officially it ended in 2009. So Russia had a lot of its own problems. I mean, this is one of the reasons it couldn't really do much for Serbia, for the former Yugoslavia in 1999 with the NATO intervention, right? Because it was just in a very, very weak position. How we talk about China having a century of humiliation. For Russia, I would say this was at least a decade of humiliation, if not more. So from that perspective, I don't really think the Russian state could have done more in terms of fostering decent relationships with the former republics. I mean, they definitely did in some cases, but I think there were definite limits because of the issues that Russia was facing itself that were much more pertinent and survival based. And a little bit less important than, we also, well, look, these guys have their NGOs, we got to have our NGOs there too. You know what I'm saying? So it was definitely a matter of survival for Russia in that particular period. So, I think you're muted.
Sorry, I don't want to get too deep into the war because that obviously warrants its own episode. But just how we're leading up to the war, NATO's kind of dangling this carrot. Georgia's, I don't whether they're forced or not, but they're beefing up their military and forced to spend more GDP. Then the war happens. And there's no NATO, there's no West that comes in and saves Georgia. How does Georgia feel after this? They go to war with their old motherland, and the one that said that they were going to have their back was like, "Whoa, what are you guys thinking?"
Well, this is really interesting because remember, this is 888, right? So this is like during the Olympics, which how many we've had the Maidan during the Sochi Olympics. I believe this was the Beijing Olympics in 2008. So everyone is distracted. And I think, I don't know if you've ever sort of retroactively looked at the type of propaganda that was coming out about Russia invading Georgia, blah, 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 blah. And then a few months later, we had Reuters publish parts of a report that was actually commissioned by the European Commission. And the headline, I mean, you can look it up now, says Georgia started war with Russia, EU-backed report. And so, it takes a lot more effort to sort of counter and debunk bullshit that initially comes out. So I'm not sure how many people actually paid attention to that, but it definitely was public knowledge that it was Saakashvili who initiated military action. And again, this was over South Ossetia and Abkhazia, these two technically breakaway republics, provinces, whatever you want to call them, Internationally, most countries consider them an integral part of Georgia, but some countries recognize them as independent. They definitely claim that they have been oppressed, ethnically oppressed by Georgia. Again, the fact that they're part of Georgia in the first place has to do with Soviet borders, much like I mentioned. This is sort of this issue that keeps coming up with, with Donbass in Ukraine and here with Georgia. And so, basically, it's also just, if you actually look at South Ossetia, right? This was like one of the contention points between Russia and Georgia, and Russia was sort of protecting them, peacekeepers. North Ossetia is part of Russia, so it's kind of like, well, why is the South part of Georgia, the North is part of Russia, thanks to these border questions, even though technically Ossetians are the same people. Like, why are they separated like that? So, this is kind of a clear illustration of all these really obvious problems that came from the Soviet dissolution. But yeah, I'm not really sure if people paid attention to the fact that it was, this official EU Commission report, or I guess it was European Union report commissioned by the European Union, actually acknowledged that Saakashvili was the one who attacked. So you can make sort of, you can put on your tinfoil hat and see, who was egging Saakashvili on behind the scenes to actually do this during the Olympics. And, I think the answer, if not obvious, is pretty clear, that certain Western leadership, certain Western powers may have been encouraging him and perhaps maybe leading him on a little bit. Now, he just from his public appearances, he seems very, very narcissistic, very boastful, just very full of himself. And so perhaps he did have that grandiose sense of, I'm going to do this and I will be backed. Maybe he wasn't offered assurances, but I think there might have been some going on behind the scenes just to see what Russia does. Because remember, this is a year after the famous Munich speech, right, where Putin really tried to sort of set the ground rules for how the relationship between Russia and Western Europe, North America, how they should operate, and that it should really be on equal terms instead of having more of a kind of a Russia is our vassal, much like it was in the 1990s. So there was definitely that awareness in Western circles that even though Russia of 2007 is not Russia of today, there was definitely this idea that Russia is kind of heading in its own direction, even though it was definitely dominated by the NGOs were still legal, the media, et cetera, brands. So this is, my take on it is that there was some serious going on with Saakashvili behind the scenes. And so obviously for Georgians, losing what they consider their land and what the international community considers their land, not everyone, but this was a huge shock, right? So in that sense, there was definitely anti-Russian sentiment because Russians came in and they took our land, even though technically these republics are they're not part of Russia, they are independent, but Russia protects them basically. And so yeah, there was definitely, I would say this was one of the focal points, one of the highest points of anti-Russian sentiment because of losing, these chunks of land with people who didn't really want to be there, but I think they're kind of disregarding that. And then I would say in the second decade of the present century, the relationship started slowly improving, and that's thanks to the, in part, Georgian Dream Party, which is, still the ruling party. And I would say it wasn't like, ooh, they're now pro-Russian. It was just more of a realization that we are sharing a continent. Russia is a huge market for us. Russia used to import not just Georgian wine, other products as well, a huge destination for tourism, et cetera, et cetera. So there was this realization that it's better for us to maintain decent relationships with both. Like, why should we choose one? Why should we have a zero-sum situation? Why can't we have a decent relationship with Russia and have a decent relationship with the EU? And now, of course, Georgia officially has these EU aspirations, so it is sort of facing towards the European Union, although your intro here to the show has that famous clip of leaving Russia in tatters. And so since Georgia just adopted this foreign agent law, I saw headlines saying that Georgia's EU dream is in tatters. So I'm not sure if it's like in tatters, like really in tatters, or in tatters like Russia is in tatters after sanctions?
The good news if it's like Russia's tatters. Good news for Georgia. But you mentioned the Georgian dream, and that was my next question anyway. So they win in 2012. And what is the Georgian dream, and what is their policy? You mentioned they kind of are looking to straddle it
Well,
more.
the party was initially started by a famous businessman, right? And this businessman, obviously, his focus is business, so he wants to make money, and so he wants Georgia to benefit from multiple trading partners, right? Not just having this zero-sum situation. And so this is one of the reasons why these business ties to Russia, that you're seeing the foreign agent law being described as the Russian law. The other reason is that Russia also has a foreign agent law, and all of those laws are based on the American law, but we can get into that a little bit in a few minutes, right? So one of the reasons is like, Georgia has ties to Russia, business ties. Like, how dare they? Even though Georgia also has business ties to Western countries too. And so, yeah, this. I would say the Georgian dream, just my perception of it, and it's a party that's been reelected now multiple times, right? So obviously, the Georgian people keep electing it. We can sort of argue, debate the benefits and drawbacks of democracy and how many people actually participate in the elections. But sort of on the surface, people clearly want this party to be in power, and this is a party that has a more reasonable policy towards Russia. It's not like a pro-Russian party. It's still definitely facing towards the West, but it's not as insane as Saakashvili, who wanted to go to war with Russia. So it's sort of a kind of a happy medium, if we compare the previous decade, right, the first decade of the 20th century with Saakashvili. So when Georgia decided to introduce this foreign agent law, this is why you're having such an insane uproar. And have you actually looked at what the law is on the surface?
Yeah.
It sounds reasonable, right? It's if you're getting more than 20% funding coming from foreign sources, it doesn't matter if that foreign source is, the European Union or Russia. Like, wasn't that a good thing? Don't you want to know if Russians are funding Georgian media? Then you can go and scream that Russians are controlling Georgia. I mean, I don't know. But yeah, it sounds, on the surface, it sounds really reasonable. If you're getting more than 20% of your funds coming from a foreign country, they want transparency. You have to declare them and declare who it's coming from and what you're going to be using it for. And it's very much like similar laws in many, many, many other countries. I mean, there are sort of smaller distinctions, but they're all on sort of at its foundation, they're all related to the American 1938 FAR law, the Foreign Agent Registration Act, which is, again, it's kind of brazenly shocking to me that they would be calling it the Russian law, because the Russian law of 2012 is also based on the American law. So clearly, everyone considers this American law to be pretty reasonable, and sort of using it as sort of the legal foundation and adapting it to their own countries. But you're never going to see this in the mainstream coverage. This is where it's coming from. You basically see it described as the Russian law. So yeah, the reason you have it described as a Russian law is twofold, right? Like I said, one is the fact that Georgia has some business ties to Russia, again, very reasonable. And the other reason is that Russia has a similar law, a foreign agent law from 2012. So
you mentioned the current president. I'm not even going to attempt this Georgian Zorabishvili.
Yeah, Salome Zurabishvili. I'm pronouncing it with a Russian accent, so I'm sure Georgians might get upset with me saying it. Her name in this way.
The Vili is very Russian accented, but so you talked about her upbringing, 3 decades as a French diplomat. I think Saakashvili gave her her Georgian citizenship.
Yes, exactly. She was not even a Georgian citizen. And this is how, like we said, this is how she differs from these younger politicians that were educated in the West after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, right? So she was born in France. She's a member of the Georgian diaspora, so ethnically she is Georgian. And not only was she sort of a diplomat in France, sort of going up in the ranks. Let me check her title so I don't butcher it. She was the first secretary to the permanent mission of France to NATO in Brussels. So she's she is a literal NATO diplomat. Like
NATO kid.
Yeah, exactly. And then of course in '03 and '04, she was an ambassador of France to Georgia, and this is when Saakashvili gave her Georgian citizenship and made her into a foreign minister. So it was like a really quick, moving chess pieces on the board. Well, here you're representing NATO, here you're representing France and Georgia. Now you're going to be representing Georgia as a foreign minister. Oh yeah, and by the way, here's your citizenship. So it was just, to me, it's like the empire assembling people, bureaucrats that, benefited in some way and moving her to, for this new role, like really, really quick. So yeah, it's kind of remarkable. And so so the Georgian political system is such that she doesn't have veto power, which is why there was this big stink that she has veto power, but she doesn't have executive power, I guess is the term for it. So she vetoed the foreign agent law, but then the parliament can come and override it basically if they have the majority, which is what they did. So yeah, she's a remarkable specimen in this regard.
Her kids are like Beltway kids. I think they work with like Hillary Clinton NGOs in Washington D.C. But how did she wind up getting elected? Like, what was her platform? And
well, I think initially, I think it was kind of that same euphoria of the Rose Revolution, and finally we're going to be financially abundant. We're going to join the civilized West, et cetera, et cetera. I think eventually she actually had a break with Saakashvili, and she was eventually picked up by the Georgian Dream. So she was endorsed by them until very recently, when she sort of started fulfilling her role as a former European/NATO diplomat, and the Georgian Dream said no. And so this is when she had this big break with them. And so it's kind of remarkable having the president undermining the parliamentarians that were elected in her country. So she kind of had this. I mean, I don't know to what extent she's an opportunist, but to me, she strikes me kind of like an opportunist, where she's like, well, she comes in with Saakashvili, then she breaks away when Saakashvili is not as popular with the Georgian war, right? And then she's been endorsed by the Georgian Dream because she's kind of riding this sort of middle road, right? And then, foreign agent law, I'm gonna have to disclose my funding, right? So basically that has been her trajectory.
So so we're not even the prime minister. We're just going to leave that name.
Another one, right? Well, his first name is very common, right? It's Irakli. The last name, I probably, like I said, I pronounce it in Russian way. It's Kobahidze. Whenever you have that KH, it's like a harsh H sound. Yeah, Kobahidze. Yeah, he's definitely pleasantly surprised me, I guess I would say.
Yeah, he's kind of surging in popularity. We have a lot of these kind of younger leaders that are like a little bit of nationalism. I don't like to call them nationalists, because
patriotism, I guess, would be a better.
Healthy amount of nationalism, I will say. But he's quickly become popular. He's a favorite on Twitter and Telegram, kind of like, the badassery, whatever. But what are his views on domestic policy? Sort of the bill, the protests, and he also said he came out and said it. The U.S. funded NGOs are trying to create revolutions in Georgia. How is this common for him to be speaking out like this?
Well, I think he was it just seems like he really, he does share this popularity. So this is the thing that's interesting to me, because if you were to look at, again, mainstream English, maybe French, let's say Western media coverage, it seems like, he's hated. There are all these people protesting. But if you actually go into social media, again, maybe it's a government page, maybe they're deleting some comments, but I've seen them some in real time, and I would Google translate them because I don't speak Georgian. Thank you, Mom. And just really, really, really support it. Just, you're doing the right thing, blah, 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 blah. We support the law. So what the Western media is portraying, and I know social media comments are kind of anecdotal, but it does give you a little bit of an impression. Obviously, this is also a party that's been reelected multiple times. That also tells us that clearly someone wants this party there, someone wants him there. And yeah, it seems like on social media, what you're seeing in the Georgian language is very different from the Western media coverage, that actually he does have a lot of support, that people will think the law is very reasonable, having transparency is very reasonable. And the whole, you probably saw, right, when a European commissioner had a little intimidating talk with him and basically mentioned the assassination attempt on Robert Fico, right? And then the Georgian prime minister kind of freaked out and decided that I'm gonna publicize this because this is insane. And when that media when that news the media first broke the news, it seemed like can this even be real? Like is he really making this up? And then a couple of hours later, the European commissioner said, yeah, we did have this conversation, but he misinterpreted it. So it was just like one of these insane things because it sounded like the threat of, oh, if you're going to ratify this law, be careful, you might end up in the protest and someone might actually do bad things to you. It sounded like a mafia level threat.
It did.
So to have this European commissioner come out and say, well, yes, I did mention it, but I really was just really concerned about his safety of my friend Irakli, right? So it was just like absolutely insane to have that, coming from the civilized garden, right, quote unquote, of the European Union. Yeah, and then I saw people were posting this interview that he gave, and it was in Georgian, it was subtitled, and I was like, wow, this interview is insane. I wonder if the subtitles are correct. So I actually went and fact checked it very recently, and yeah, he gave an interview to Georgia's Channel One, so it's sort of like one of their main channels. It's from May 23rd, I believe, or at least the article on it was published on May 23rd, and yeah, he made some really really harsh statements. He basically said that the powers that be in the official West wanted to open a second front in Ukraine to harm Russia. And he said that, yes, Russia probably would have been harmed in this way. However, it would have destroyed Georgia to the point where we probably couldn't even rebuild, like worse than Ukraine. Like this was the statement that he made. And he constantly refers to, quote unquote, the party of global war. Not the global party of war, but he's like, it says literally party of global war. He kind of talks about it generally, but I guess we could say again, the powers that be, right? Possibly from the official West. And he talks about that, in his opinion, the European Union and the United States need to be, it's like, I don't even know how to translate this word. So they have lots of oligarchs, and the oligarchs need to lose their power. So he says like de-oligarchize, like he uses like a made-up word here. But yeah, this interview is really kind of shocking, because if you think about the state of the Ukraine war and just the death toll of obviously Russian soldiers, but also Ukrainians, just absolutely massive. And if you were to consider what would have happened if Georgia were involved in a conflict as a second front, it's just, people again, the powers that be, the global hegemon who is writing this policy. I mean, there's just no concern for human life, and obviously there's just this desire to puppeteer little conflicts, or big conflicts rather, around Russia without getting their hands dirty. So it's really kind of shocking. So I feel like he's basically, or the prime minister, like Irakli, Kobahidze, I'm going to keep butchering his name. I feel like he understands that he is popular in his country and he survived these protests. And he also is kind of sick of the level of intimidation that he's been getting from, Georgia was threatened with sanctions. Again, the European dream is in tatters, blah, 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 blah. So I think he's kind of had it. Right. Just this is my impression from his public statements, because they're pretty harsh. Right. So the fact that he's now making statements and he's actually accusing, right, the European Union, the US, and the global, the party of global war coming after Georgia. Georgia is small, but we want our people to thrive. It's pretty blunt. You don't really see comments like that. I mean, maybe Viktor Orban would say things like that. Maybe not even quite as harshly. So it's actually kind of pleasantly surprising. Hopefully he stays safe. I mean, that's all we can say. In thinking
really
of
after Fico was hurt, severely hurt. The reactions of the world leaders, the certain world leaders, which was Georgia, Hungary, and I think Serbia, and I was like, yeah, they're all the ones that are like, I'm next. Let's.
Yeah, we got to improve our security detail right now. Yeah, so definitely, this is kind of my take on it. I think he sort of wants to take a harsher stance here, because there's for his party, there are certain red lines that cannot be crossed. And the the ability to have that transparency for these NGOs, the media that's funded by foreign government, is one of those red lines. And I don't know if you saw this particular post or tweet, but I've referred to this on my own channel because it's just kind of very, very indicative to me, but also just kind of funny. So this person is the director of, what is his full title here, of the Foreign Policy Research European Neighborhood Council, right? So they're like in Europe, but they have their little fingers in the Balkans, Turkey, Caucasus, right, Central Asia, Middle East, and North Africa. So basically everywhere, right? And so he posted this post. I don't know if we're allowed to call it a tweet anymore. In early May, it's sort of at the height of the protest, and he basically broke down why this law is very bad. And it really doesn't really explain why the law is very bad. So he explains sort of the details, right? The 20% or more funding needs to be disclosed, yada, yada, yada. And he basically says that this is very bad because when you're part of the European Union, multiple countries can be funding you, and that's going to slow things down, and we can't fund universities. And so again, he doesn't really provide enough of a reason not to have this law, other than like it might slow things down when Georgia is in the European Union, which it's not. So it's like, hello guys, you haven't even accepted them. So what's the problem? And and then he goes on to say that the Georgian government is, quote, accused of sabotaging Georgia's EU membership. The law, quote, the law does not correspond with what a EU candidate country screening and opening or closing of accession chapters would require, end quote. And then he talks about Georgian government and specific business elites being alleged to be receiving contracts and money and pressure from Russia. It's like, you guys are threatening Georgia with sanctions and ending their EU dream. So I guess that's not pressure. And if you look at the comments, people are asking why 20% funding or more being disclosed is unreasonable. And he basically just goes around in circles repeating what he said. So basically this NGO dude is unable to explain other than, oh, well, within the EU, we get funding from different countries and that's going to slow things down. But there's really no fundamental reason why this law is bad. So it's really to me, it was very telling to see his inability as this talking head from this think tank to explain why this law is really bad, other than the fact that now we'll know who is funding whom and to do what, right? So it's really kind of amazing.
Do you think that the prime minister is kind of understanding, because Georgia, it's one of those places, it's like Armenia, you only know of its significance if you're actually like politically and geographically like interested or in tune, because Georgia is a huge pivot point between the East and the West, and that's really their leverage hugely. And Serbia is the same. And then you have Slovakia, who's also has been saying like, we're talking about like Slav unity and stuff like that. So is he kind of understanding like Georgia is actually, regardless of its economic or sociological situation, its geopolitical situation gives it a tremendous amount of power?
I think he understands that, but I also don't think he has an inflated opinion of just how much pressure Georgia itself can apply to other countries. Because the way he talks about this potential second front opening, right, in 2022, he does talk about Georgia as kind of a small country that can't really, militarily protect itself and can't really engage in warfare and in the Ukraine crisis in any shape or form. So I think he seems to have a pretty healthy idea of Georgia's position. Like you're saying, it's a kind of a niche topic. It's a small country, but the fact that it's been all over the news, right? Mainstream Western media news, hence people mistaking Georgia the state and Georgia the country, tells you that even a little country in the Caucasus can have that geopolitical significance, especially in trying to pit it against Russia, much like happened in 2008. And obviously Georgians seem to be unwilling to go down that road this time around, at least as far as electing this party over and over again goes, and this is the party's position. So I think he seems to have a pretty healthy idea of the status of his country. But again, I think the amount of pressure and intimidation that's been going on behind the scenes that made him publicize this is pretty telling. Like, it's probably just the tip of the iceberg of what he's saying in public. I can't even imagine what's been said right in private. So the fact that he perceived this thing as a threat on his life and had to protect himself and to release it to the media immediately after that phone call, I mean, it's just really, really significant. So yeah.
You did mention this video earlier, but we uploaded it and I want to show it to everybody how ridiculous this is. So here's our American friends who got lost on the way to Atlanta and wound up in
I'm sorry, one of my canines decided to come and be an analyst.
We are a dog-friendly show, very dog-friendly. I'm dog-friendly, the producer's not. While you get the dog, we'll play the video. Here we go.
Cowards wear masks. Cowards wear masks. United States of America.
They're saying that I was here to foment a revolution and overthrow the government, which is, wow. I came to go backpacking and drink some wine and look at art. I didn't know there were protests going on when I arrived here.
It makes me sound like James Bond or something. I'm just a humble English teacher who likes to go with my friends out on the weekends.
I was protesting, and I was out here expressing my freedom of expression. I was not vandalizing, I was not wrecking anything. All of a sudden, it was like this avalanche, this surge of police officers down over there that just pushed everybody back. And then all of a sudden, like that, they snatched me.
It was so chaotic. I was kind of caught in the middle of the crowd and the police and got sandwiched. Next thing you know,
they had me in both arms, and I was kind of face down. And as they dragged me through, officers all took their turn punching me, and there was uppercuts, and I got a big smash in my face. And it was a good beating. When I was taken to the detention area, one of the officers said, you hurt our feelings by calling us cowards and criminals.
I want my phone.
I was angry. I was upset. I was honestly pretty sad that this is happening.
I'm American. I want my phone right now.
They said this other American that I was arrested with, we were in league, it was a conspiracy, and I had never met him before. We were put in a police van together. I believe in their fights. It's hard for me to think about those people that I was with that morning that were beaten and bloody and unconscious, and how they continue to kick and beat them.
I think that if you value democracy, you value freedom anywhere, you got to support it everywhere.
The suffering that they took was horrific. I was honored to give them aid and comfort. I was honored to be here.
We've gone from, I was here to just backpack and
I had no idea there were protests. It's not like the State Department issues warnings about travel warnings about going to certain countries that have protests to, I was then protesting. I had no idea, but then I was protesting within this, within the same context. It's just kind of remarkable.
I love the crocodile tears. Like, I really believe in their cause. How did we get from not even knowing that what was happening, and now we believe in their cause? I'm hysterically crying and yelling at police officers for them. Like, what happened? And I mean, they're both released pretty immediately and look completely unharmed and totally safe. But of course, it's got to be like
imagine describing yourself as a humble English teacher. I mean, who actually talks like that? I'm humble. It's not like I'm James Bond, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. I'm a humble.
Here's your background. You are a humble English teacher. That's all he's read this whole time.
Describe your bio. Yeah, I'm a humble English teacher. Yeah, it's kind of remarkable. Yeah, so it's I don't even know what the BBC was thinking when they released this. It's just a treasure trove of, it's like Monty Python, but yeah.
Yes. It's like we're all onto you, and this is making it worse, right? You guys know that, like, it's
well, like I said, it's these guys are mentioned. I'm assuming it's these guys as people who were arrested. Oh yeah, it does say including 2 U.S. nationals. So it's these guys who are the humble English teacher and the guy who had no idea there were protests. He just came to backpack and drink wine and look at art, and all of a sudden he is in the middle of the protests. Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. So
we kind of went through this last year, but but this time the law gets through completely. It passes. It has 3 votes. She can't veto it. The president can't veto it. Matt Miller has his own emotional breakdown, which we'll watch really quickly. It's not as long as the last video.
Earlier today, the Georgian parliament voted to override the Georgian president's veto of an anti-democratic foreign influence bill that fails to conform to European norms, effectively turning the bill into law. The United States condemns this action. In passing this law, the ruling Georgian Dream Party moved the country farther away from the European integration path and ignored the Euro-Atlantic aspirations of the Georgian people, who have taken to the streets for weeks to oppose this law. The Georgian Dream has disregarded the Council of Europe's Venice Commission legal assessment and that of Georgia's closest partners, who made clear their concerns that the law would stigmatize civil society and media and limit fundamental freedoms. The ruling party's actions and anti-Western rhetoric threaten Georgia's democratic trajectory, future economic security, EU membership, and also put the U.S.-Georgia relationship at risk. Last week, Secretary Blinken announced that anyone who undermines democratic processes or institutions in Georgia, as well as their immediate family members, may be found ineligible for U.S. visas under a newly announced policy precluding travel to the United States. The United States has also launched a comprehensive review of bilateral cooperation between the United States and Georgia. As Secretary Blinken said last week, we will take Georgia Dream's actions into account as we decide our own. The United States continues to stand by the Georgian people as they work for a democratic and Western future. It is unfortunate that Georgia's leaders are choosing to forego the steps needed to advance Georgia in the Western direction that its people want.
Okay, so besides his ridiculous, overdramatic reaction while he denies the genocide in Gaza and claims that Ukraine is a humanitarian disaster, what is different about this time the law going through? This law has been on the table for at least 2-3 years. They've known about it. They know the Georgian Dream Party. What helps this law go all the way through? What happens now? Or is the government at risk of being dissolved? Can she dissolve parliament? Is there another color revolution on the horizon? And yeah, etc.
Well, obviously, it's a dynamic situation, so it remains to be seen. Now, again, the party seems to be popular, and I think we should be taking what we're seeing in the Western media with a grain of salt. I think sometimes these the loudest protesters might be in a minority. Again, it's really difficult to say. Some of them might just be naive young people. Some of them might be people working for foreign NGOs that are threatened about their funding that is now, at risk. Not having to basically have that level of transparency puts them at risk. So it's really difficult to say, because I think the picture on the screen is a little bit different than the picture that's behind the scenes. My perspective that I think the Western powers did issue pretty harsh statements, but because Georgia is important to them for the geopolitical reasons that you mentioned, they might, suck it up and keep cooperating with Georgia because they don't want Georgia facing any farther towards Russia than they have. And they haven't really. I don't think business interests with multiple countries are an indication of a unilateral direction, right? It could be, they can be doing business with whomever they want. So I think it really depends the extent to which they consider Georgia important to their basically way of, well, maybe not involving Georgia in a war, but kind of drawing Russia into another conflict, right? So I think it really depends not on Georgia itself, but in its role at these crossroads, right, between Europe and West Asia, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know if there's going to be a color revolution. I think there's certainly the fact that the law has passed. I think it's going to take a little while for it to actually start working. But the fact that these NGOs, some of them might not be able to operate the way they have, might really stifle their ability to to foment any kind of a color revolution. But I don't think they're completely out of danger in this regard. So again, I think it's a dynamic situation. It's something that we should be watching. But I also think these harsh words and Georgian integration is really, a lot of it is about Russia, not just Georgia itself. So I think it just depends on how useful Georgia is to the powers that be. So
well, very indicative of who's kind of in dynamic situations. I mean, you're my first of the potential color revolution episodes. We got to do an Armenia one and a Serbia one. It's all the same like characters. And it's like a revolving door. And if you were paying attention for 10 years, you're like, this is just a rerun.
Of course. I mean, if you think about the attempt right before the special military operation, right, as Russia calls it, was launched in February 2022, there was an attempt at a revolutionary scenario in Kazakhstan, right, in January. And I think everyone forgot about it because it was resolved pretty quickly and successfully. But that was definitely one of the possible flashpoints. And this was one of the only cases where the collective security treaty with Russia, Kazakhstan, and a couple of other countries was actually activated and used. I mean, I don't even remember having this military mini alliance implemented in this way before. So yeah, like you're saying, anytime one place is calm, another place on Russia's periphery may be not so calm. So I think we kind of have to think about the different chess pieces in a broader context too, not just Georgia, but also again how useful Georgia is to these people. But I think there is a little bit of a realization on the part of the Georgian people, again, maybe not some of these young naive students, et cetera, where they kind of see themselves as pawns if their representatives are able to make such statements on public television for all to see. And so I really don't think they like being in that position, although they realize they are, a smaller country with the ability of larger countries to influence them in some way. Yeah. So
I think people forget, you mentioned Kazakhstan, and people forget even Belarus, that great meme of Batka saying like, oh, you're upset. He's talking about the NGOs and they were kicked out. And now Belarus turned into a tyrannical, genocidal dictatorship overnight. But it's exactly the same thing. And that's why I'm curious to watch Georgia kind of implement this law and in time before the NGOs start acting crazy.
Yeah, I mean, Lukashenko himself was essentially saved from, a color revolutionary attempt. Some would say he was saved by Putin, and then Kazakhstan was also saved from the same situation by implementing the collective security treaty. Yeah, so I think Lukashenko in the sort of the late maybe 2016, 2017, 2018, he kind of flirted with the West and also the extreme ethno-nationalists, much like Ukraine did. And then he found out the hard way that that's probably not the best thing to do when he saw, the level of involvement and the protests and all the self-described presidents that are now operating from their Twitter and claiming to still be presidents. Yeah, and so I think he found out the hard way. So Georgia, even though it's not really in the Russian sphere of influence, I think is really realizing that this European cooperation has a lot of strings attached, and I don't know if they're going to reevaluate the extent to which they want to be on these strings, right, and to be controlled by them. So
recently, the mayor of the capital, actually, he was interviewed, and he said, I love this quote. He said, in 2014, a revolution took place in Ukraine, and we all see what they are now. Therefore, I want to tell everyone once again, both inside and outside the country, that Ukrainization will not happen in Georgia. We have seen and know how much misery war brings. We will not allow anyone to open a second front in the country, join the sanctions, etc. Neither America nor Europe nor Russia can be our master. Our master is His Excellency, the Georgian people. So we've heard Ukrainization a few times from officials in Georgia. What does that mean to someone who is Georgian? I mean, we had the Georgian Legion, who was like the heroes for Ukraine. But, we hear from a lot of people inside Georgia this Ukrainization. We will not be Ukrainized. What does that mean to a Georgian?
Well, I'm only partly Georgian, right? I'm only quarter Georgian, and I don't speak the language, but it is a culture that is important to me. I think it's exactly it's kind of amazing that this has become a word, right? I don't know if it's in a dictionary, but the fact that people understand what it means when we say Ukrainization, right? So it basically talks about having some kind of a regime change and then using that state that has had a regime change to basically as a testing ground for weapons against Russia to achieve particular geopolitical goals. So this is what the Georgia's prime minister talked about when he mentioned opening the second front. And it's actually very interesting because now that this law has passed, Georgia's president, I saw that she was making these statements in the news. She was using Ukrainization in a little bit of a different way. She was almost inviting more Western meddling. She was saying, look, all these Russians, all these anti-war Russians fled to Georgia. She named, I don't know if this number is accurate. She said there are now 100,000 Russians in Georgia. I don't know if that's accurate, but certainly some people who opposed the launch of the special military operation, that's where they went. It was sort of one of the closest near abroad countries without having to go through the bureaucratic process of living in somewhere in Europe, in Western Europe. And so this is where they went. So she was saying, oh, look, now Russia is going to claim that the Russians in Georgia are going to be in need of protection. So Russia is going to do the same thing that they did in Donbass. So she was kind of like flipping it around and saying that now that we have all these Russians, they're going to be used for Russia to enter. So it was really kind of amazing, but maybe not surprising that she was trying to, so she was kind of turning the table on this idea and saying that, oh, look, now Russia has to protect these Russians, even though these Russians left because they were disagreeing with the policy of the Russian government. So I don't even know if that's a comparable situation. So it was very interesting to see her invite, additional. Well, the law is passed, but you guys can come in other ways, basically. So
we get a lot of really cool geopolitical words like balkanization and Ukrainization from the West.
None of which means anything good, basically, in most cases.
They're all the worst things ever. All right, last question. You have been incredible, and everybody is so psyched in the chat. But so, what is, in your opinion, what is the best possible outcome for Georgia? And I want to talk about Irakli's recent tweet. He's on Independence Day. He says, I congratulate Independence Day to each Georgian, each citizen of our country, celebrating the main day of the nation within the country or beyond its borders. Our Georgian dream is to live in a strong Georgia by 2030, together with our Abkhaz and Ossetian brothers and sisters. United and strong Georgia should become a fully fledged member of the European family in 2030. That's a pretty heavy tweet. Was it that just a placation, and do you think that Georgia should continue to straddle the east-west? Because well,
I think it's completely unreasonable to assume that Abkhazia and South Ossetia are going to be reincorporated into Georgia in any shape or form, because they don't want to be. There might be another universe in which this could happen with Georgia being federalized, but I think they've been sort of breakaway republics for long enough not to want to be part of Georgia, and also much like Donbass breaking away and seeing what happened to the rest of Ukraine, I think there's also that kind of a realization. So yeah, I think that particular aspect of a united Georgia geographically with these, again, according to these ethnicities or sub-ethnicities, they perceive themselves as being oppressed. I don't think they want to be part of Georgia. So that's unreasonable. The 2030, it sounds like a slogan. It's really kind of now that the European Union, again, it all goes back to the question of how useful is Georgia for them to perhaps ignore the passing of this law that they were so hysterical about and still pursue European integration. But 2030 seems to be very unreasonable to me in light of these recent developments. So, to me, it seems like it's a political slogan. But again, it remains to be seen. I feel like we haven't really seen the consequences other than, apart from these really harsh statements. And if we start seeing consequences that are tangible, like, some kind of sanctions being implemented, then we could probably arrive at a more concrete conclusion, right, about the impact of this law. But yeah, the statement itself seems a little bit naive to me.
Well, I don't want Abkhazia to be part of Georgia if it comes down to it. So
right.
I feel like I guess like in this instance, if Georgia goes to the EU, the breakaway republics will do the same. And that's what we're seeing in Moldova.
Exactly.
Hungary, like it's everywhere. So I guess it's good. I'm really thankful that you came on for this episode. So please tell our viewers where they can find you, where they can find more information about Georgia in this vein, and what you're working on.
Well, we actually did 2 episodes on my little YouTube channel. It's just at Nina Byzantina. I use the same moniker on Twitter/X. So that those probably same on Telegram. Those probably would be the main places where you can find me. And one of our episodes was more on the general Russian-Georgian relations. So we went into a little bit more detail. So if people want to listen to it. And then another one was kind of similar to what we talked about here, but of course now there's been other developments as well. So yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you for the questions. I'm glad to be representing Georgia, although ethnically I'm only about a quarter Georgian, but
you're the most Georgian person that I know personally.
Well, whenever I want to, like I told you, Georgia has lots of little ethnicities, and a lot of times, as far as Georgia goes, you can tell by people's last names. So I always like to kind of scare people as a joke a little bit. So if you think about Stalin, his last name was Jugashvili, and one of my ancestral names ends with Shvili. So I'm like, well, I'm Emiratian like Stalin. And then one of my other ancestral last names ends with Iya, like Beria. So I was like, well, I'm a little bit like Beria and I'm a little bit like Stalin because I have these two. So I'm basically, that's really scary, scary dictator. But yeah.
A little bit of breaking news. Nina, you might be interested as well. Not such great news. U.S. State Department has forced Scott Ritter off of the plane headed to Russia. His passport has been confiscated. This is a statement from Scott. As I was boarding my flight out of New York, I was pulled aside by 3 CBP officers who seized my passport. When asked why, they said they were orders of the State Department. No further information has been provided. My bags were removed from the flight and I was escorted out of the airport. He was slated to participate in the annual St. Petersburg International Economic Forum as a guest speaker. Coincidentally, his traveling companion, former New Jersey Supreme Court Judge Andrew Napolitano, was also detained and prevented from boarding the flight. The ex-Marine, or what is known so far, is that Ritter says that Customs and Border Patrol have not given his passport back. They were scheduled to perform at SBIEF. This year, the forum was supposed to take place from June 5th through 8th. Pepe Escobar said, little Blinky's utter mediocrity, imbecilic pettiness now in day glow for the whole planet to see, preventing Scott and Judge Knapp from boarding a plane in NYC to attend St. Petersburg Forum. That was Pepe Escobar. Pepe Escobar and Jackson Hinkle are both there already. So I guess the noose is tightening around people like us. This would have been Scott's 3rd trip to Russia, I think, in 2 years. So yeah.
Well, it's kind of shocking that he is like a U.S. citizen who is prevented from freely traveling. But yeah, it's definitely good to know.
Yeah. So if you're gonna go now and don't come back, I guess.
Exactly. For those of you who can leave, some of us cannot. Yeah.
So somebody wanted to know, what is your favorite food?
My favorite food is in like culturally or specifically.
Let's do culturally.
Well, culturally, I would definitely say Georgian is better than Russian, as much as I like Russian food. But also Japanese. Yeah. So I'm kind of predictable. Japanese, Georgian, Russian would be maybe the 3rd. So oh my gosh.
Whoa, really? I wouldn't even put Russian that high. Don't kill me, everybody. All right, thank you. Thank you guys so much.
And I'm just having another canine coming in. So yeah, sorry.
No, you're fine. The dogs will take us out. I don't even know what we've got going on this week. John Jackman's coming on at some point, and Professor Morandi on Thursday, I think. So stay tuned, guys, and we'll keep you updated on all things Scott Ritter. And we will we have contacted him and made contact, so he's able to talk. But yeah, so thanks again, Nina, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye.
Guys, go to ddgeopolitics.com and give us money so we can get out of here too before they confiscate our passports. Bye.